האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov, good evening, Dobro V'Yetzer. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Vayikra. We're beginning the sefer Vayikra, the third book of the Torah, and we're going to do Os Zion, section number 7. Our learning tonight is in the merit of Miriam Riva Brina Bas David finding a shidduch. God willing, she should find the right shidduch soon, and they should build a bayis ne'eman b'Yisrael, God be'ezras Hashem. In order to really understand right at the start, the first paragraph here in the Zera Shimshon, we need to know about 2 episodes from Navi. Both are from Sefer Shmuel. The first one is from Shmuel Aleph. The second one is from Shmuel Beis. So let me just briefly mention those. In Sefer Shmuel Aleph, we are told that, in Sefer Shmuel Beis, we are told that David HaMelech had a famine in the kingdom for 3 years, for 3 consecutive years, and this, of course, brought about terrible suffering for the Jewish people. And David HaMelech consulted the Urim V'Tumim, and he received a response from Hashem saying that the reason the famine was happening was because of Shaul's actions against the Givonim. When Shaul had the city of Nov, Ir Kohanim, a city of the Kohanim, wiped out. So that brings us to that episode, which we also need to explain. In that episode, it goes back to the time when Shaul HaMelech was pursuing David, was highly suspicious of David, and was pursuing him to try and have him captured and in all likelihood killed. And David was on the run, and he ran to this city of Nov, which, as we said, was called Nov Ir Kohanim. It was a city where Kohanim lived. David came there, and he made no mention of the fact that he was on the run from Shaul. He acted as if he was actually on a mission from Shaul, and the people, the Kohanim, took care of him. They gave him provisions. They gave him a sword. The famous sword of Goliath, of Goliath, was there, and they gave it to him. And David went on his way, and then Shaul found out about this and interpreted the episode as an act of rebellion by the Kohanim in the city of Nov, which it was not, and sent Doeg Ha'edomi to wipe them out, which he did. When he did that, when Doeg wiped out the Kohanim of the city of Nov, the people called the Givonim, who were dependent upon that city because they, from the time of Yehoshua, which is a whole different story, they had been set up as wood choppers and water carriers for the needs of the Mishkan, and they were dependent upon sustenance from the Kohanim who lived in the city of Nov. And so they began to suffer grievously from the fact that the city that they were dependent upon for their livelihood had been wiped out on Shaul's command. And when David asked about the reason for the famine, the answer he received is that it was because of how Shaul had caused this tremendous suffering to the Givonim, and apparently also did other things. There's reason to believe that he tried to exile them from the land, and some of them were killed, and that's the whole story. So let's, that's a quick thumbnail sketch of the story. Let's get into the Zera Shimshon Os Zion, and we'll see how these things come into play. Perek Vav de Eruvin, in the 6th chapter of Maseches Eruvin. Omar Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda. Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda said, Kol ha-mishager matnosav l'chohen echad. Anyone who gives all of his the gifts that he's obligated from the Torah to give to a Kohen, and he gives all of them to one Kohen, for example, Truma. If a person takes the produce, the portion of his produce that he is intended to give to Kohanim called Truma, that only Kohanim can eat, and instead of spreading it around, distributing it to many people, he gives it to one specific Kohen only, Mevi Ra'av La'olam. That person is bringing famine to the world. shene'emar, as the pasuk says, v'gam ira hayairi hayachohen leDavid. The pasuk says that a person named Ira hayairi was a kohen for David, and Chazal tell us that what that means is that David Hamelech gave this individual all of his truma, all of the produce that he was supposed to distribute to different kohanim. He gave specifically only to this kohen Ira hayairi. Usamichle, and next to that pasuk, there's another pasuk which says, "Vayehi ra'av bimei David." There was a famine in the time of David. That's the famine that we mentioned, the 3-year famine that we mentioned a few moments ago. So Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda says that we can see from what happened with David HaMelech, who gave all of his gifts to one specific Kohen, all of his truma to one specific Kohen, and then the next pasuk talks about the famine that happened, that we can see that what David did was wrong, it was inappropriate, and it brought about this famine. Vehikshu batosvos, in the commentary of Tosfos, they ask a question. Vehabi Yevamos, behold, in Meseches Yevamos Amrinon, we say, Shehoya mipnei Shaul. The reason for the famine wasn't because of David giving truma to one specific Kohen. The Gemara in Yevamah says the reason was because of Shaul, Asher Hamis es HaGivonim, who brought about the death of the Givonim, and that we also mentioned a few moments ago. Shaul had the city of Nov wiped out. This brought great death and suffering to the Givonim. And so why do we have the Gemara in Eruvin seemingly contradicting the Gemara in Yevamos by saying the reason was of something David did by giving his truma to one person, and in Yevamos it says it's because of what Shaul did. The Sertu and the Tosfos answer, the ha v'ha garma. This and this caused it. Ad kan Lashono, until here's a quote from Tosfos. So Tosfos answers the question by saying the reason we have two different statements given in two different Gemaras about why the famine happened in the time of David HaMelech, the terrible famine, is because both elements together caused the famine to happen. It's not just one of the two reasons, it's both of them together. Next paragraph. Tzarech Ian, we need to analyze. How do these two things, the episode with David giving his truma to one Kohen and the episode with Shaul causing suffering to the Givonim, how do they combine together? Ve'amai b'chada minayhu, and why is it that just one of them, luchud by itself, lo hayayochol lavo hara'av, would not have been able to bring the famine? V'ha kol chada minayhu, and behold, each one of them, nikra gozel es ha'aniyim, is called stealing or robbing from the poor, from the needy. Both the event of David and both the event of Shaul, as the Zera Shimshon will explain, can be considered acts of depriving needy people. Uchasiv, and we have a pasuk in Tehillim which says, "Mishod aniyim," from plundering from the poor, may enkas evyonim, and from causing the needy to cry out, "Ata akum," now I will rise up. Hashem says, "V'chuli, v'chule." So the pasuk in Tehillim says that when you steal from the needy and the poor and you deprive them of their sustenance, Hashem rises up to bring punishment. And both episodes could be connected to that verse, Shahare David, because David, Shahayanosein Kol Masrosav Lechoen Echad, who gave all of his produce gifts to one Kohen, Hayamariv Esa Acherim, he was depriving the other Kohanim by not giving, by not spreading and distributing his gifts from his produce to many different Kohanim, the families of many different Kohanim. He was depriving them and not giving them what they deserved, because he gave all of it to one Kohen, as we said. V'Shaul nami, and Shaul also, Amrinon, we say Besof Baba Kama, at the end of Maseches Baba Kama, de garama ba'alma chayev. When a person causes something indirectly, he's obligated for that. And Shaul's action of having the city of Nov, the Kohanim of the city of Nov wiped out, indirectly brought death and suffering to the Givonim, and therefore he's responsible for that according to the Gemara in Baba Kama. So the Zera Shimshon's question is, since David's sin by itself, or we should say David's action by itself, and Shaul's action by itself would seem to both fall into the category of depriving the needy, and depriving the needy, we know from the Pasuk in Tehillim that the Zera Shimshon just brought, can lead to a punishment from Hashem. Why can't we just use one of the two reasons, or we should say, why can't the Gemara use one of the two reasons, either David's action or Shaul's action, to explain the reason behind the famine? Why does one Gemara, why do we need a combination in two different Gemaras of the two different episodes, the episode with David and the episode with Shaul? That's the question. Next paragraph. V'nira lomar, and it would appear to say, Teha below ha lo sagil. This one, this episode, without this one, the other episode, lo sagil, would not have been sufficient. Sha'al kol echad mehem, because for each of them, ha yumakom lehimolet ulehoshiv, there was room to escape punishment and to reply. In other words, both David and Shaul could have given a justification for what they did that would have allowed them to escape any kind of punishment for the people. And the famine would not have come if only one of the two episodes happened. Umnam, however, bihitztaref shnehem yachad, with both of the episodes combined, ein teshuva. There is no legitimate response, and therefore suffering to the Jewish people resulted. A famine came because of the combination of David's actions and Shaul's actions in the episodes that we described. Next page, top of the right column. She'im hayim mevi hara'av al chei David. If Hashem had brought the famine just because of the sin of David, meaning giving his produce to only one individual, to one specific Kohen, David could have responded and said, the Kohanim forgive or concede to each other, meaning in situations when a person brings his gifts to one Kohen, the other Kohanim understand that sometimes happens, and they concede their right to the gift, so to speak, and they say, okay, fine, this particular guy gives his stuff to one Kohen, will be able to benefit from other people and won't get anything. We accept that we're not getting anything from this specific householder. K'de'omrin b'perek kol haget, as we say in Gemara in Maseches Gittin, Almas Nisan, on the Mishnah that states, De hamalve mo'os es ha-kohen. If a person lends money to a kohen, mafrish alehen mechelkon. The lender, the malve, can separate produce to give to that kohen that he lent money to, and then if the kohen doesn't pay him back, he can sell that produce and keep the money to pay off the debt that the Kohen owes him and hasn't repaid. V'ayin sham b'perush Rashi, and see over there in Rashi's explanation where Rashi explains that the reason it's permissible for the malveh, the lender, to take from the produce that he separated for one specific Kohen, that's the point, he separated produce for one specific Kohen, is because the other Kohanim accept this idea. They realize they're not going to get any of the produce from this particular person, the lender, and therefore the lender can say, I'm going to treat my truma, my gift to the produce that I'm separating for Kohanim as if it's the property of the Kohen I lent money to, as opposed to treating it as if it's the property of all the different Kohanim that he might distribute it to. So what do we see? We see that David had a response in which he could say, I clearly have the right to give my produce to one Kohen, because there's a whole assumption in Jewish law that such a thing is known to the Kohanim. They accept the reality of such a phenomenon, of such a situation, and they make do with it. They give up their share to an individual's truma to their hypothetical share or claim to an individual's truma when they know that individual is going to give all of it to one specific Kohen. The ein koach bozeh, and therefore there's not strength in this episode, the episode of David, lahavi harav, to bring the famine. So what the Zera Shimshon is saying is that even though it's clear from one of the two Gemaras that we quoted previously that David HaMelech did something that was inappropriate by depriving other Kohanim of the gifts of his produce, even though that was inappropriate, it wasn't enough of a transgression to cause a famine, which obviously is an extreme punishment, because David had a way of explaining his actions that would have brought justification to it, at least partial justification to it. Next paragraph. And if the famine would have been brought al chet Shaul levado, because of the sin of Shaul itself, by itself, meaning the sin shehem mises hagivonim, that he brought about death and suffering to the givonim, dahainu, that this means shegoram lohem lehafsid mizono sehem, he caused them to lose their sustenance. As we mentioned in the beginning, the Givonim were completely dependent upon the Kohanim of the city of Nov for their sustenance. The city of Nov was wiped out at Shaul's orders, and therefore the Givonim were deprived of their sustenance. Kidi Amridan b'Yavamus, as the Gemara states in Maseches Yavamus, mitoch sheharag Nov ir haKohanim, through the fact that Shaul had the Kohanim of the city of Nov killed, shehoyu misapkim lagivonim mayim umazon. They used to supply to the Givonim water and food. So the Gemara in Yevamos clearly states what it was that Shaul's actions caused. They caused great suffering and famine and even death to come to the Givonim. Kemosha Pirush Rashi Sham, as Rashi explains on that Gemara. Gamze levado, also this by itself, eino chet maspik, is not a sufficient transgression to bring about the famine. Shehare Shaul yochul litaretz, because Shaul could have answered, sheyecholim lihistapek mimaiser ani. Shaul could have answered that, yes, I took away their source of sustenance. However, they could have supplied themselves from the Maiser Ani, the tithe for poor people that the Jewish people give every third and sixth year of the Shemitah cycle. People donate their produce to the poor. And so these poor Givonim could have sustained themselves from that. Umi matnos aniyim, and from the gifts that people generally give to the poor. Umin hatzedakah, and from in the matnos aniyim means the agricultural gifts that people are obligated to leave for the poor when they harvest their fields, things like called leket, shichecha, peah, all types of different agricultural gifts that everyone is obligated to leave for the poor when they harvest their fields. So the Givonim could have taken from food from that. Uminat staka, and from charity, people who give charity, the Givonim could have supplied themselves from that. Shehare misha mechalik la'aniyim, because someone who distributes charity to the poor, eino yochol litein kol hatzedakos, he's not able to give all of his charity funds le'ani echad bilvad, to only one poor person, ulehaniach sha'ar ha'aniyim, and to leave out all the other poor people. This is a critical point. Zera Shimshon is saying that Shaul's whole justification about why he shouldn't be considered responsible for depriving the Givonim was that they could go and collect from charity and receive agricultural gifts as poor people. And they would have to be included because a person's not allowed to just give their tzedakah and their charity and their agricultural gifts for the poor to one poor person. Kid'isa b'shulchan aruch, as it states in the Code of Jewish Law, Yoredeya, the section called Yoredeya, Siman Reish Nun Zayin, chapter 257, Seif Tes, paragraph 9. So the Zera Shimshon says this idea about the requirement to spread around your charity and gifts and not just give them to one poor person is brought down in halacha. V'im kain, and if so, mimanov shach. However you slice it, kol Yisrael mechuyavim litain lahem har parnasa. All of the Jewish people would have been obligated to give to the Givonim enough to sustain them, because that's the obligation of tzedakah. People would not be allowed to say, oh, I have this one poor person on my block, and he's such a nice, appreciative individual, I'm going to give all my tzedakah to him. And it turns out everyone in the neighborhood is only giving their tzedakah to this one poor person, and all the other poor people are going hungry. That's not allowed, the Zera Shimshon says. And therefore, Shaul could have conceivably argued that the Givonim were not in such bad shape because he killed the Kohanim of the city. He had the Kohanim of the city of Nov killed, and therefore they lost their sustenance. Yes, it's true. But Shaul could have argued that they could have been sustained by the rest of the Jewish people's charity. Let us continue. Omnam, next paragraph, however, Lefi das David, however, according to the view of David HaMelech, Shehoya Mishager Kol Matnosov Lechoin Echad, who used to give all of his Kohanic gifts to one Kohen, Lefizeh, according to this, Kol Echad ve'echad, every individual Jewish person, Yochol Litein Kol Tzidkosav, could give all of his charity, Le'ohavo, to a good friend who he loved, O Lekrovo, or to a poor relative, V'lo Yochush Klal L'shar Ha'aniyim, and not to be concerned at all about the other poor people. So David HaMelech seemed to set an example here that it was okay to pick one person and give him all of your truma and all of your agricultural gifts that you separated for the Kohanim at large, but you've decided to only give it to one Kohen. So too, according to that theory, everyone could give all of their charity to one person. Ve'elu ha-givonim, and the Givonim, the people of Givon, shehayu gerim gerurim v'nimasim, who were low and repulsive converts be'enei Yisrael, in the eyes of the Jewish people, shehare hayu asurim lavo bekahal, because they were forbidden to marry into the Jewish people. A person from Givon could not marry a Jewish woman. So even though they were at a certain level in the time, even though back in the time of Yoshua, as we mentioned in the beginning, they were accepted to join the Jewish people, they were only allowed to marry among themselves. They were not allowed to truly assimilate and join up into the Jewish people as normal gerim, as normal converts are. Uchtesiv, as it's written in Sefer Shmuel, V'ha-givonim lo mi b'nei Yisrael hema. The Givonim were not considered truly part of b'nei Yisrael in the sense that they could not marry in to the Jewish people. Yiyu nisharim, they would have remained bivadai, certainly b'li michya umazon, without sustenance and food. Shahare Yisrael lo yachushu alehem klal, because the Jewish people would not have been concerned about them at all. So the Givonim, when they lost their sustenance from the city of Nov at Shaul's command, they didn't have the option to go and get food and tzedakah from anywhere else that Jewish people were, because the Jewish people would not give them tzedakah. The yirtzu litain, and the regular people would wish to give, top of the next column, kol hamatnos aniyim, all of their gifts for the poor, lemishu Yisrael gomor, to someone who was a full-fledged Jewish person. Oleger tzedek, or to a truly righteous convert, haroi lavo bakohal, who would be allowed to marry into the congregation. A person who converts, a regular non-Jew who converts and accepts upon himself or herself the full requirements of halacha and has a fully kosher conversion, that person is of course allowed to marry a Jew. And such a person would receive tzedakah from regular people who wanted to give gifts to the poor. However, the Givonim would be excluded from those gifts because of their unique lower status. Umishum hachi, and because of this, ha v'ha garma, because of this reasoning that the Zera Shimshon has explained and developed, both the case of David and the case of Shaul together caused the famine to come. She'im lo ha'yachet David, because if David had not done his sin of giving all of his produce to only one Kohen, cheto shel Shaul, in that such a case, then the sin of Shaul lo hayoroi laonesh would not have been sufficient or would not have been appropriate to bring the punishment of the famine. So let's pause for a moment to make sure we understand how the Zera Shimshon now has answered his initial question about why both sins were necessary. So the sin of Shaul HaMelech, of bringing about suffering and even death to the Givonim, was considered a very serious action. However, the idea of depriving the Givonim of sustenance and food would not have been considered so terrible if they could have supported themselves from the charitable gifts of the rest of the Jewish people. However, the rest of the Jewish people had a right to exclude them based on the model that David set of giving all of his truma to one Kohen. So too, people could have reasoned, well, if David could do that, and David was, of course, a great leader of the people and Torah scholar, then people would assume they could give their gifts of tzedakah, of charity, to one specific ani, poor person who might be related to them or friendly with them, or perhaps a couple of people, but they don't need to distribute their charity widely, and therefore the Givonim would have been at the low end, the lowest rung of the totem pole, and very likely would not have received any tzedakah. So it's because of David's actions with the individual Kohen that Shaul's sin becomes much more significant and much more grievous and problematic. And therefore, it's the combination of the two that resulted in the famine. Next paragraph. Ve'af al gav deha garma, and even though both sins together caused the raw of the famine, mikol makom, nevertheless, kishishoal David ba'urim v'tumim, when David asked of the urim v'tumim, the Kohen's breastplate, as to why the famine had happened, lo heshivu lo rak al chet Shaul, the response was only about the sin of Shaul. It didn't mention both sins, only Shaul's sin. Mishum sheShaul gorum lahem hefsid bevadai, because Shaul clearly and definitely caused a great loss to the Givonim, baharigas Nov ir haKohanim, in the wiping out of the city of Nov, which was the city of Kohanim. Shemisham hayolahem de michyasam barevach, because from that city they received all of their needs, all of their sustenance. The relationship of the Givonim as wood choppers and water suppliers, water carriers for the Mishkan, meant that the Kohanim of the city of Nov were very familiar with them and very appreciative of their work and their hard labor, and therefore supplied them well. So Shaul wiped out the only group of people who really cared for the Givonim and took care of them. Besides from anything that the Givonim could have received from tzedakah. So the Urim V'Tumim only mentioned Shaul's action because Shaul's action was much more decisive and much more clear in causing problems for the Givonim than the fact that David HaMelech gave his truma only to one Kohen, which, yes, it's true, added to the problems of the Givonim, but it came nowhere near the level of causing their problems as did Shaul's actions. The Ode, and furthermore, it's possible that someone who is supplied with charity, sometimes a person who his all sustenance comes from charity might be missing food, might be not have bread to eat on a certain day. Because sometimes people don't give anything. When we see a person collecting for tzedakah, sometimes we think, oh boy, look how many people are giving that person tzedakah, but we don't see the times when no one gives the person tzedakah and they don't have food for themselves and their family. V'zeh nikra chet. And this, meaning this action of Shaul in putting the Givonim in a situation when they literally had no food to eat sometimes and they were totally dependent upon the goodwill of strangers, that's called a chet. That's a sin, lefi shehem einam mochalim, because the poor do not forgive that type of situation. We said before that the poor, that the Kohanim do forgive if one person doesn't give them from the truma and only gives it to a specific Kohen, or that the Kohanim understand and forgive. But if poor people end up with no food and no one gives them anything and they have no bread to even eat, then that's not something that they concede or forgive. Aval shel David, next paragraph, but the actions of David, afal pi shelo asa tov, even though he did not do the right thing, lo nikra chet. In the end, it's not called a real transgression. Sha'are lo asa keneged hadin, because he did not act in violation of the law. The hatnan begitten kavose, because we saw the Mishnah in Maseches Gittin that followed his viewpoint, meaning the Mishnah in Maseches Gittin that the Zera Shimshon quoted above taught us that a person is allowed to assume that if he's going to give all of his truma to one Kohen, then the other Kohanim will forgive that, and the truma can completely belong to the Kohen who he selects. Mishum de machale ahadadi, because as we said when we over there in that Gemara, it says that the Kohanim forgive each other in those situations, kenizkar la'el, as was mentioned previously. Next paragraph, final paragraph. And now that we see, that we have found that Shaul was obligated for his indirect action, he didn't actually harm any member of the Givonim himself directly, but his orders to wipe out the city of Nov caused tremendous suffering to those people. Even though his intention was to wipe out the city of Nov, not to harm the Givonim, at least originally, that left David in a situation where he needed to examine his actions. David was required to say, if Shaul's indirect actions I see now led to this famine, then I need to look at my own actions carefully and scrutinize them. Perhaps I have done something unintentionally or indirectly that caused the problem. David needed to look and see, did he perhaps have an action that he took that could have indirectly caused the problem or suffering, even though he didn't intend it? And he examined his actions and found he realized and took note of the fact that he was giving all of his gifts to one Kohen. And he was the king, Shematnosov Merubos, who had a tremendous amount of truma and produce to give. Moshe Kosov Maharsha, as it says as it's written in the commentary of the Maharsha. Ushar ha'aniyim, and the rest of the poor, shelo hayu nizonim ela mehatzdaka, who only would be supplied from tzedakah, after she'eze yom lo hayu lehem ma le'echol, perhaps there were certain days when they had nothing to eat. V'hayu lo laseis lechulam me'at, and therefore David HaMelech should have spread his abundant produce and gifts from his produce around giving everyone a little bit, and not rely on charity that other people might give these poor individuals. And this is why the Gemara in the very beginning brought down the connection between the two psukim. V'gam ira hayairi. David had a Kohen named Ira hayairi that he gave all his truma to. And that pasuk was right before the pasuk Vayihi Ra'av, the famine came. Because even though David's actions were not technically considered a chait, nonetheless, it was setting a bad model for the people and a model that led to poor people not being supplied with food. And therefore, David needed to change his actions as well and spread out his charitable giving to as many people as possible. Yasher koach for joining us in the Zera Shimshon this week. We look forward, God willing, to learning again together in the Zera Shimshon next week.